You guys, and welcome back to Tomes of Terror, doing another book review. I know I didn't do any last week, I just didn't have time, but I'm getting back into the swing of things now. So, other day, I was kind of in the mood for kind of a good old fashioned Gothic horror story. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes you get in that kind of mood, and I was in that kind of mood the other day. So, I'm looking through my Kindle Unlimited recommendations, and lo and behold, seemed to kind of read my mind once again because there popped up, for my literary pleasure, a book called The Haunting of Whitehall Manor by L.V. Pires, a Gothic horror story, says right across the top. And I was like, where have you been all my life? There we go. I had actually never read anything by this author before, but she's apparently written a lot of very well-reviewed and award-winning novels and stories and stuff like that. So I figured, this will be a very solid choice. And like I said, I read like the sentence synopsis, and I was like, that sounds pretty interesting. Let's dive right in. Please note that this book is the first in a trilogy. The other two books are The Curse of Whitehall Manor and then The Fall of Whitehall Manor. All of these books came out the same year, 2023. I will probably be reading those, like the other two, in the near future, but I will say that the first book, it doesn't end like on a cliffhanger or anything like that. So, it's not like it necessitates a sequel. Like, you'll be left like, what the fuck? Now I have to read the second book, you know what I mean? Like, it's pretty self-contained, but it leaves things open enough for, if you wanted to continue on with the story, then you could. So overall, I'm going to say I enjoy this book quite a bit. It really kept me guessing through it. It has like all of these twists and turns, had some like pretty spooky, like creepy sequences in it. And it wrapped up, like I said, in a pretty satisfying way that if you wanted to continue on with the story, you could, but it's like you didn't feel obligated to because it left a bunch of stuff, like a bunch of threads hanging, you know what I mean? The main character, I'll admit, isn't super likable, but she is relatable, you know what I mean? So it's not like you're so pissed off with her that you're just like, oh geez, bitch, you know what I mean? But she's a little bit irritating, but not in a really off-putting way. I also could have done without the romance angle. I'm not a big fan of like romance novels in general, so I don't really like that when it's in. But it is Gothic horror, so that kind of implies that there's probably going to be a romance. But the romance in this, I felt like was a little bit rushed and a little bit underdeveloped. So I didn't love that, but it didn't ruin the story or anything like that. Some of the prose struck me as slightly clunky, but I'm gonna say, like, in the aggregate, I really liked this book. I liked it enough to be interested, like I said, in the next two novels in the series, which I will eventually get around to reading, I'm sure. So we're following a 33-year-old woman named Anne Towry. And she lives alone in a big city. I don't think they specify what city it is, but just in a big city. And she's kind of like adrift in life, I guess. She's unemployed. She doesn't really have any close friendships or, romantic prospects to speak of. She doesn't even have any pets or like any hobbies that she's super passionate about. So a lot of this malaise, if you want to call it that, probably stems from her upbringing, which she has spent years in therapy since, like, coping with, right? So she grew up in this huge mansion called Whitehall Manor, obviously, of the title. So her dad was massively, massively wealthy. I mean, staff, like huge ground, the whole 9 yards. So she was pretty much brought up with every privilege in life, right? Like super, super rich. And she particularly remembers from her childhood, like her father always doting on her and giving her all these gifts. And she remembers spending like all of these happy hours like playing in these huge lavish gardens at the manor and kind of going through this well-stocked library and just having like a really, really nice childhood. Not entirely though, because she still does have like some kind of darker memories of her childhood as well. Her mother, Seraphine, was always distant and kind of cold toward her. She never really played with her or showed her any affection. She particularly remembers like one birthday party where her and her dad were there with the cake and her mom was like standing back in the corner, like not saying anything to her and just kind of staring at her with what seemed like hostility or at least indifference. And then, as the kind of cherry on top, when Anne was 10 years old, she got sent away to a boarding school, much to her anguish. So she still has a very, very vivid memory of her mother, like while she's being bundled into the car, like to be taken away to the boarding school, her mother telling her, don't ever come back here. Like, don't ever come back to Whitehall. So because Anne has always believed, because of these memories, that her mother hated her for some reason, and also has blamed her for kind of snatching her away from her beloved father and the only home that she ever knew growing up. Anne has not spoken to her mother at all, like since that day, since she was 10 years old. So this trauma from her childhood has really kind of done a number on her psychologically for the past 23 years up until the present, events of the book. So imagine her surprise, and honestly kind of suspicion also, when she gets this phone call from a guy named Dr. Cornish, who's actually been looking after Seraphine in the whatever town like Whitehall Manor is in. It was actually only through Dr. Cornish that Anne found out that her father actually died like 2 months prior to the events of the book. And this kind of gives Anne yet another reason to resent her mom, since Seraphine, seemingly couldn't even be bothered to like call Anne to tell her that he had died. You know what I mean? So she's really, really mad about that. This time, though, Dr. Cornish is calling because Seraphine has kind of, sort of gone missing. He goes to the house to check on her. She won't open the door. She won't answer any of his summons or anything like that. So he thinks maybe something has happened to her. Maybe she's hurt. Maybe she's dead in there. Like, they don't really know. And he thinks that maybe it would be better if Anne came up there to see what her mother's deal was, because she has gotten increasingly like resentful toward the doctor, I guess, and doesn't want to let him in. So Anne, of course, is not real keen on this idea and basically says, you handle it yourself, because I went no contact with that bitch a long time ago. But he is eventually able to persuade her to at least come up for one day and try to figure out what's going on. So Anne, finally, she's just like, okay, fine, but just for one day. So she drives up to Whitehall. When she gets there, the first thing she notices is that this formerly beautiful house that she grew up in has, fallen to rack and ruin. This is not really much of a shock, I guess, because Seraphine is older now, and the family fortune, which was substantial, has apparently been depleted to a point where she can't really afford the staff to look after the place anymore, right? Now, Anne is, obviously really sad to see the manor in this horrible state. She is, however, somewhat touched to see that her father's grave is in this really, really pretty marigold garden that she always played in as a child. So she likes that it was there, and she gets to kind of say goodbye to him because she didn't get to before. So Anne goes into the house, which is not locked, and is, much more heartbroken to see it's just a complete fucking mess inside. It's like the electricity has been shut off, the plumbing doesn't really work, like the water's all brown and shit, and it appears that Seraphine has been hoarding the place up. There's all these stacks and stacks of bins and boxes and stuff, and they all have dirt and grass and pine cones and other crap that she evidently brought in from outside and put them in these boxes and then stacked all these boxes around the house. So, obviously there's something going on. Now, when she first goes in, there's a horrible, horrible smell in the place, smell of death, which, is a very distinctive smell. So she's convinced, well, Seraphine must be dead in here somewhere, because that's the only thing that would smell that bad. But then she is confronted with her much-aged, clearly very unwell mother, who's kind of scrawny and crazy looking, and she kind of scurries out and basically tells her to get lost. I don't want you here. So Anne, who is already kind of over all this shit, she's just like, okay, bye. She's like, all right, I'm going to leave. So Anne then calls up Dr. Cornish, tells him, hey, Seraphine's alive and well. She doesn't want my help, so fuck her. I'm going back home. But a couple of things transpire to keep this from happening, of course. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a story. First, she meets this kind of studly dude named Darren, who is actually the groundskeeper at Whitehall Manor. Now, he tells Anne that Seraphine does not pay him, but allows him to live in this kind of nice little cottage on the grounds in exchange for him taking care of the gardens, right? And he kind of feels bad and takes care of her and stuff. Now, Anne, who it's implied hasn't had any dick in a while, is kind of intrigued by the idea of maybe having a fling with this hunky fella here. But she also kind of doesn't want him to think that she's an asshole for abandoning her clearly very sick mother, even though he's not really aware of the history between them. The second thing is that Dr. Cornish kind of drops his nuts and threatens to report Anne to Adult Protective Services if she doesn't at least stay long enough to arrange care for her mom, who is, obviously deteriorating. The problem is that Anne is pretty much broke. Like I said, she's unemployed. And apparently the entire Towery fortune has been pissed away somehow. So there's really no money to hire someone to look after Seraphine. So all of this stuff has to be figured out, and she's kind of stuck there until all of that can happen. So long story short, too late, Anne, as I said, gets stuck in this crumbling mansion with a woman she hates who obviously does not want her there. The place is gross and dirty and hoarded, and it's cold in there. It's a total fire hazard because Seraphine just insists on running the fireplace all the time, and there's all this like old paper and shit just laying around all over the floor. It's filled with the carcasses of dead animals who crawled in through like holes in the walls and roof and stuff, hence the death smell. There's also really very little food and not much drinkable water in the house either, so it's not a real comfortable place to stay, in other words. Now, the only bright spot in this whole sordid mess is Anne's developing relationship with Taryn, which, as I mentioned earlier, struck me as kind of rushed, unnecessary, and a little bit underbaked, I'm going to say. He also disappears from the story for long stretches. There is a reason for this, admittedly, but I don't know. I kind of feel like he was just in there for reasons, which I don't really want to say what, because it might be kind of a little bit of a spoiler. But I didn't like that she just shows up, she meets the guy like 5 minutes after getting to the house, and is like, ooh, look at this handsome fella. And then it's like 10 minutes later, it seems like they're in love. It's just like a weird, I don't know. It just seemed like it happened too fast for me. Maybe that was just my perception or whatever. Like I said, I'm not real into romance subplots, but it is a Gothic story, so yeah, you're going to get that. But I just thought it happened too quickly. You know what I mean? They developed feelings for each other too quickly. They got too intimate too quickly. It wasn't like, I don't know. Like, it was set up that she's like, hey, I'm just going to have a fling with him. But then, like thinking that, but then like a few minutes later, she's like, oh, we're in love kind of thing. Like, not exactly, but it just kind of struck me as that. So it kind of bothered me a little bit. So yeah, so all that aside. So as if staying in this once grand shithole wasn't bad enough, like, and she obviously doesn't want to be here with this woman who hates her, Anne also starts to think that maybe she could be losing her mind, or that maybe this house is maybe haunted. So there's that. Seraphine has blocked off one entire wing of the house by barricading like the only door with this big bin that's like full of solid concrete, right? So you can't move it. Despite this, and Seraphine saying don't ever go in there, Anne nonetheless thinks that she hears somebody moving around in there. And a couple of times she sees someone that appears to be Seraphine in the windows of some of the closed off rooms. And be like, well, how the fuck did she even get in there? You know what I mean? Anne also hears like screaming and gunshots on multiple occasions, usually in the middle of the night, and sometimes feels somebody watching her, or at one time like chasing her, like when she's outside in the gardens. So the problem then becomes, has Anne succumbed to the Towery curse, which they go into in the book a little bit, of kind of like mental illness that struck many of her relatives, or is this place really haunted? And or is there something much more nefarious going on? So I gotta admit, I did not expect the kind of strange paths this story went down. Which was definitely like a point in the book's favor, right? Like, just when I thought that I had guessed what might be happening, some new wrinkle appeared that kind of sent events off in an entirely different direction that I was not expecting. I did find the resolution of the mystery to be a tad convoluted, but I didn't really mind it all that much, because at least it was original and was actually like not predictable in the slightest. I don't think I predicted a single thing that happened in this book, which is unusual. So if you like Gothic horror stories that are kind of set in these ramshackle old mansions and, deal with long buried secrets and madness and scandals and stuff like that, and I mean, honestly, like, who doesn't love that stuff? Because I certainly do. Then this book should be probably like right up your alley, I would imagine. It had a few little things about it that I wasn't a huge fan of, admittedly, but all in all, it did kind of keep me engaged the entire time. I was really like eager to keep reading and like find out what crazy shit was going to happen next. And like I mentioned before, I also liked that this could very easily just be read as a standalone one-off story because it, you know, wraps everything up. But it did leave enough kind of intriguing threads open to continue on into the next 2 books if you wanted to do that. And like I said, I will probably eventually get around to like reading the next 2 because I'm curious enough to like to see what happened next, you know? So that will do it for this Tomes of Terror. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment if you did. And I'll see you guys again on the next one. Bye.